I hate that name! My name's no Shaymus! God, everybody stop calling me Shaymus!
It's me, I'm back. That's all there is to say about that. I have some things to say about Metroid 2. That's all there is to say about that. Metroid 2 is in a bit of an awkward spot, sandwiched as it is between a revolutionary predecessor and a legendary sequel. But while Metroid is this raw, awkward proof of concept that Super Metroid perfected, Metroid 2 is a tentative step in another direction for the series. It's a more linear, atmosphere-focused direction that would later be developed more successfully in Metroid Fusion. And certainly in the past I've muddled through Metroid 2 without really paying attention. I didn't think it had much to offer me outside of nostalgia. This was the first game that I ever played. But I played it through there after Samus Returns, and has anybody noticed that it's actively incredible? If you're concentrating on it, if you are listening to what the game is trying to tell you, Metroid 2 is impressively ambitious. It's the story of the fall of this ancient civilization. SR388 is saturated with Chozo ruins and temples that have been reclaimed by the native fauna and flora. And people will tell you that the Game Boy's graphics couldn't tell this story, and they'd be right. They couldn't, and they don't. The level design does. That's right, YouTube critics, I'm using your rhetoric to defend a bad game. Metroid's cycle saw the player gather power-ups to open up the map, which then allowed them to gather more power-ups. In Metroid 2, gathering power-ups is still important, but it's not #the point. The level design is regimented not by how many you've collected, but by how many Metroids you've killed. Your focus is on one area at a time, and the game uses that focus to contextualise the items more strongly, not as an arbitrary power-up to suit the game mechanics, but instead as an artifact left behind by a dead civilization. The game matches its level design to its theme, juxtaposing the massive caverns of the temple's exteriors with the claustrophobic interiors. The temples have fallen apart, they are crumbling ruins now. To get in, you often need to dislodge loose blocks with explosives and then squeeze through the narrow passageways behind them. And you will find yourself frustrated by pointless mazes and dead ends. And people will tell you that that's bad level design, but it is made this way to sell the fact that this is a ruin. It's a haphazard pile of debris, you're not always going to find something interesting. Each new area is split into two chunks, the ruins, which are characterised by a density of power-ups, and the natural caves, which tend to have more Metroids. So every time you reach a new area, you know what to do. You need to head to the ruins to collect as many power-ups as you can before going to face the Metroids. This level design is so well conveyed that even as a 5-year-old who had never played a game before, I instantly understood where to go when I found a new area. If I went to the ruins, I would find artifactor statues which held power-ups, which would make Metroids easier. These two areas are further distinguished by the excellent soundtrack. The ruins have this theme. So the ruins theme's pretty naff. It evokes the theme, but it's droning and repetitive. But the caves. The music in the caves is honestly fucking genius. It's a single note that overrides all other music in the level, and then there's silence. Before the creaks and cracks tentatively start up again, nature buzzing back to life after the disturbance. It's almost completely silent except for a sprinkling of notes here and there, dripping down at their own pace. And the only thing interrupting this serenity is the drum of Samus's footsteps. You are the only thing out of place here. You are the only disruption. It's jarring when you take a hit and that loud, obnoxious error sound pierces the silence. It's jarring when you fire a shot and cause this sharp burst of noise. It's a Game Boy game with an almost diegetic soundtrack. How mental is that? Meanwhile, you're sitting there like, it's not Tetris, is it? It's not do. Yeah, okay, so Tetris is pretty great. It's easy to assume that the sound designers just did a bad job, and I might even believe that if these bits of the game weren't meticulously designed to fuck you up. The Metroids are the masters of the planet, and you never know exactly where or when you're going to run into one, and the game knows exactly how to play off of that fact. It knows to let you blast through a couple of Goron nests before throwing a Metroid in there to make you jump. The game only needs to do that once, but every single time you go through a nest afterwards, there's that little hint of uncertainty. There's also this bit where you see the Metroid husk and set off down the corridor. There's no map, so you don't know what's coming. There are no enemies either, which is a telltale sign that a Metroid's about. And for that entire first room, you are on edge, waiting for that sting to kick in and the fight to start. But it doesn't. That only happens in the second room. And then further down this nest, there is an identical setup, only the Metroid's in the first room instead. The Metroids genuinely give me the absolute fear in this game, and that's not just the graphics or music doing that work. A lot of people say that they get lost because the backgrounds are so repetitive, but that's not the problem. It's that the level design itself is repetitive, and that's not an accident. The game repeats and reuses bits of level design and geometry to throw you off. Knowing that the game could turn the tables on you at a moment's notice is genuinely unnerving, even if the Metroids aren't particularly threatening. It is masterful how deftly the developers broke the rules of level design to mess with you. And look, this stuff's been said before. Recently, both Josh Wallen of The Geek Critique and Mark Brown of Game Maker's Toolkit have recognised Metroid 2's merits, and I'm honestly a wee bit upset that those videos are so good. Kinda stole my thunder there a bit, lads. It's a bit rude to not wait at least 2.5 years for me to get my video out. But I don't think even they explore just how incredible Metroid 2 is at storytelling entirely through its level design. Mark Brown explored how the game was able to create surprising moments by changing the placement of the husks. My favourite example of this is this bit in Area 3, where you can spot a Gamma Metroid through an impenetrable wall. I spent ages wandering around trying to find out how to reach this thing before I thought the situation through logically. How would a Metroid get from its husk to behind this wall? It burrowed. That's great! No? Okay, how about this one? Every time you kill all the Metroids in an area, the corrosive liquid drains, allowing you access to the next part of the game. That's unbelievably coincidental, right? It's almost like there's something massive at the heart of SR388, something that's moving around and creating seismic disturbances, something that's maybe distressed when Metroids die. The bit that just fucking obliterated my mind in this run through though was Area 7. Mark Brown identified this as a bit of characteristic subversion for the game. You beat a Metroid and the liquid rises rather than falls. What's more interesting to me though is why it did this. There's only a single Metroid in this area, and with the long build up you would be forgiven for thinking that this was going to be a difficult fight. But instead you find a freshly molted Alpha Metroid, an enemy that at this point is just kind of bullying. You've been fighting these things since the very start, and by now Samus is at full power. So you kill it, and immediately notice the second husk right behind it. It's only afterwards that you realise you're trapped, looping back around to the chamber where you just fought the Alpha. And hovering over the husk of its younger brother is the first of the Omega Metroids. Do you get what's happening here? You've just killed a hatchling that this adult Metroid was trying to protect. It left the Alpha unguarded as it molted and returned to find only a corpse. And I'm not reading too much into that, this was not a mistake. It is foreshadowing the plot twist at the end of the game that Metroids have a parental instinct. But the king of storytelling is Area 8. The music has a relentless pressure. This is no longer Samus disturbing a serene, natural place, but instead a place that is already twisted and dissonant. The level design's dedication to selling its story here is remarkable. The Metroids are the planet's apex predators, so there are no other enemies in the final area. It leaves you alone to stew in anticipation. Once you defeat the Omegas, there's only one Metroid left in the planet, and the game doesn't distract you from that goal by bombarding you with enemies. You are entirely focused on the upcoming battle as you climb this colossal chamber. At the top, you find a ruined Artifactor statue containing the Ice Beam power-up. And this room says so much using so little. Years before Super Metroid all but explained this in the manual, Metroid 2 hints that the Chozo had something to do with the Metroid's creation. The Metroid's lair is in a dilapidated Chozo temple, a dilapidated temple that is purpose-built with the very artifact that can contain them. It also implies that the Metroids had something to do with the Chozo's disappearance. They clearly sniffed out their weakness and did their best to destroy it. It implies that the Metroids are actually fairly intelligent creatures. As you climb higher, you find what is unmistakably an egg, hinting at the possibility of more Metroids, and you have just enough time to realise the danger before the Metroid counter goes crazy. And after you battle your way through the 8 Metroid hatchlings, the final chamber echoes with the forlorn wails of the Metroid Queen. And it all comes together here. The Metroid's intelligence, their familial instinct, the fact that something has been creating seismic disturbances that have plagued you throughout the entire game. All of those different puzzle pieces snap together in this one chamber. I really like this game, by the way. Don't know if you can tell, I really like this game. I'm not going to bullshit you, Metroid 2 is far from perfect. At least that's what everybody keeps telling me, and I'm sure if you gave me a few minutes I might be able to get these scales out my eyes and remember why that's the case. A lot of its genius is buried under a layer of crusty old monochromatic detritus. There is clearly a reason that people don't look too kindly on it. So I think that the remake was a great opportunity to bring its positives into focus. But Samus Returns doesn't have much faith in Metroid 2. A lot of the interesting stuff that I loved, like the feeling of negotiating haphazard, crumbling temples, is all but gone. In Metroid 2, you had to keep a mental map in your head. There's this amazing example before you get the high jump boots where you can see a hidden chamber from a nearby point. So you have to roughly map out where that chamber is in relationship to you, which can then help you find the hidden passage which leads you to the high jump boots. Even then, you need to not get distracted by that. You need to remember that you were there looking for a hidden passage that you haven't found yet. So you investigate below the statue and there you are. So how do you do all of this in Samus Returns? You press A. Samus Returns is one of the most difficult games in the series by default, but it's also the easiest game to complete 100%. The scan pulse not only reveals hidden areas on the map, it not only marks items there, but it also marks breakable walls for a short time after use. There's a review by Donkey, a dunk view if you will, where he goes into why he likes that, because it removes what he calls Metroid moments, bits where the game is cryptic about what you need to do to progress. And I love that guy, and he's not wrong, Metroid is bloody obtuse. But I don't like how effortless the scan pulse makes everything. Teasing out the next wee bit of the planet, learning that some breakable blocks weren't marked, realising that there was a hidden passage behind this wall fire. All of this was mystifying to me as a kid. That might be Stockholm Syndrome talking, to be honest. But it means that Samus Returns looks like a ruin, but it never feels like a ruin. The graphics sell an idea that the game just isn't backing up. Thinking back, I could remember being really impressed with Samus Returns visuals, but I couldn't actually remember the visuals themselves. There's stuff in here that really butters my bollocks if you catch my drift. Colossal alien lifeforms, worn down machinery, biomechanical caverns and Chozo architecture. But despite it catering almost directly to me, my memories of the environments are hazy. And I think that those backgrounds are so intangible because they never have anything to do with the foregrounds, or in other words, the actual game. The environments never inform any new mechanics or a shift in pacing or tone. Basically, in its efforts to be less obtuse, almost everything unique about Metroid 2 has been stripped out of Samus Returns. And while this makes the experience a lot smoother, I like my peanut butter chunky, do you know what I mean? No? Well, I like those interesting bits of gristle to a level design that make it memorable. Even if they're not always successful, even if they're not always fun, they can be valuable. I remember clearing waves of foam from underground caves before fighting a Gamma in the cramped space that I just carved out. I remember having to thread the space jump through treacherous terrain. Metroids can't even surprise you anymore, the radar pings every time one of them's nearby. Ideally the remake would have updated these mechanics to make them more fun, but it instead just removes them outright. Which means that Samus Returns is a much smoother experience, but it's also just kind of corridors filled with enemies. It's corridors filled with enemies at the beginning of the game, it's corridors filled with those same enemies at the end of the game. There isn't much here to distinguish the levels mechanically or thematically. I feel like the pace of Metroid 2 was dictated by the world it was trying to create and the story that it was trying to tell. It would go out of its way to keep the world consistent. The caves were filled with the native fauna of SR388, but only the toughest creatures could break into the temples, which were instead governed by malfunctioning automatons. In Samus Returns, the enemies are mindlessly placed, a handful of enemies blindly scattered throughout each level. I mean, the Metroids are the planet's apex predators, so why are all these creatures right in the heart of their lair? And that's not a continuity problem either, that is a pacing problem. Area 7 was gripping in Metroid 2 because there were no enemies, it was just you and the last few Omega Metroids. In Samus Returns, it is a brightly lit laboratory teeming with activity, an energetic tune straight out of Donkey Kong Country playing in the background. There is no tension because there's no anticipation. You're too busy blasting through a thick cable of enemies. So the question then becomes, is that thick cable of enemies any good? The game places a huge focus on its new counter mechanic, which lets you knock enemies away at the last second. Enemies soak damage when they're not stunned, so you're practically required to do this. It is simply the best way to get through the game. But that also means that you need to stop before almost every enemy, wait for them to attack, land the counter, and then shoot them. You're not even allowed to move during this, otherwise the enemy goes right back to being a sponge. So you are constantly starting and stopping. Accommodating the counter also means that the majority of the enemies behave in the exact same way. They glow, then charge, you counter, then shoot. It doesn't help with the game's indistinctiveness, especially as a lot of the enemies have already been cut from the original. I might be off base with this, but the counter feels like another attempt to make Metroid more like an action game. But while action games are characterised by linear, combat-focused levels, the goal in Metroid is to open up more and more of the map. The combat is secondary at best. In a worst case scenario, it's a disruption. I know that I'm not the only one that found themselves skipping enemies for a lot of the game, especially when backtracking. But I'm not entirely sure Samus Returns' problem is with the combat itself so much as it is the density of the combat. Even the most fun combat in the world needs to be paced properly, but Samus Returns is relentless. The moments of meditative exploration that were Metroid 2's bread and butter are completely gone. The game doesn't give the player any room to breathe, which I would argue is essential to Metroid's atmosphere. There's this bit in Area 3 where the mineshaft collapses as you move past. It is supposed to unnerve you, it's supposed to make you jumpy. It's a technique that Metroid has used before, particularly in Fusion. So this game's done its homework, you know? It understands on paper what makes the older games so atmospheric. But the level design simply doesn't let up, and I was so busy concentrating on the enemies that I completely missed the desired effect. There's just not enough silence for the noise to be impactful. But then, there's a very gung-ho, cool guys don't look at explosions attitude running throughout the game as it is. Samus becomes this physics-defying badass in the cutscenes, and it just feels disingenuous. Samus isn't cool because she can pin a Metroid. In fact, I think that kind of athleticism is at odds with her top-heavy character design. Samus is cool because she is clearly experienced and competent. She's alert and on guard at all times, gun raised, firm stance, constantly looking around. It's actually something that this game gets spot on outside of the cutscenes. Aim mode feels great because Samus plants herself down. She has so much heft to her. And then once you're done firing, she adjusts her stance, she relaxes a little. Because Samus is not a high octane action heroine, her series is a lot more introspective than that. The best moment in Metroid history isn't a meticulously choreographed burst of action, but a moment of quiet resolve. Samus isn't cool as fuck because she flips out and stone cold stunners Mother Brain, she's cool as fuck because she stood back up. And on that note, do we need to have Ridley back again? Like, you can do a Metroid game without Ridley, lads, that's allowed. Yeah, so it's been about 400 years since the last Metroid, believe me, I know, but besides that there is no reason for him to be here. I don't really want to talk too much about AM2R because that's a whole different kettle of mohiques, but I think that it understood how to handle fan service a lot better than Samus Returns. Metroid has always been excellent at justifying fan service, at using it in service of the story and the world. AM2R accomplished this by tying together Metroid 2 and Metroid Fusion more closely. For example, the distribution centre is flooded because Ceres burst a pipe. Not only does this make perfect sense within the series' established continuity, but more importantly, it makes perfect sense within the context of the game itself. Ridley makes no sense in either. First off, it makes Samus look really stupid. She now knows that the space pirates are still active, she can assume that they're aware of her activities, and she also knows that Ridley has survived exploding a fourth time, so she can reasonably assume that he's not dead this time either. With all that in mind, why the hell would she be so callous about leaving Ceres Space Colony unprotected? I'm getting mad about continuity again. Okay, right, here's the important bit. Shoehorning Ridley in wreaks havoc with the structure. The escape sequence at the end of the original Metroid is classic, of course, and it's become cemented as something of a Metroid tradition. But I think that it being a tradition kind of misses the point a wee bit. Because before it became tradition, it was done for specific reasons. There's hardly any respite in Metroid, so it becomes more and more stifling as the game goes on. The escape is a sharp burst of action to build some adrenaline while also relieving some of that tension. When Metroid 2 turned that on its head, I don't think that was it missing a trick, I think it was just faithful to its own themes. The final areas become more and more drawn out as you go on, with long, lonely descents between each Metroid encounter. The only living things you see are the creatures that you are charged with killing. The ending, then, is the inverse of that scenario. It's a slow ascent back to the starry skies, this time with a companion following an act of mercy. It's a very calm ending to a very lonely game. I feel like this sequence is core to Metroid 2. I don't think that you can tell this story, one of redemption for both Samus and the Metroids, without this sequence. Samus Returns hasn't done the legwork for this sequence, but it's undeniably a more bombastic game, so a change isn't necessarily a bad idea. But even taking that into account, it is totally fumbled. No longer is this the story of how Samus spared the last Metroid in the name of peace and progress. This is now the story of how Samus spared the last Metroid so she could wander all over the planet and nab the last few power-ups. Every Metroid game since Fusion has suffered from what I like to call lap of honour syndrome. If you're aiming for 100%, you are required to stop what you're doing right before the final boss and do a lap of the entire map, picking up all the items that you couldn't get before. There's no point in coming back to these items on an individual basis, there's no other reason to go back, so you might as well wait until the very end and then collect them all at once. So when I was exploring the first area and saw crystals that only the baby Metroid could destroy, my heart sank. I stopped going out of my way to collect all the items because I knew that I might as well just wait until the very end and then go around the map again. I also knew that there was going to be another boss after the Metroid Queen, since there would be no point in powering up if you were already done. It was also at this point that I guessed who the final boss was going to be, because the series has been tonguing Ridley's nads since Super Metroid. You return to the surface under a tumultuous green sky, with a tornado roaring in the background, setting the stage for your dramatic encounter with Ridley. And it's great, the fight itself is great. Ridley has always been fun to fight, and I love the strong contrast of two purple characters battling on a green backdrop. But it's designed to excite you. No longer is the quiet conclusion the focus of the sequence, but instead all eyes are on this action-packed, blood-pumping, heart-pounding fight to the death between two bitter rivals. Maybe this is my fault for going for 100%, but I realised while watching the credits that hunting down and killing Metroids was now a distant memory. The punch, the potency of the original ending was because it juxtaposed an entire game's worth of killing with this act of benevolence. By the end of Samus Returns, I'm sorry to say that I'd forgotten all about both of those things. The baby Metroid was just a power-up to me. Samus Returns just doesn't have the confident delicacy of Metroid 2. While the original was frequently obstructive to great effect, the remake is a lot friendlier, it's a lot more knowable. Even the history of the planet is laid bare. The completion bonus is a series of images showing you exactly what happened to the Chozo. But explaining the lore misses the point entirely. The facts of Metroid's lore have always been secondary to the effect that that lore has, which is to create a fleshed out, well-realised world in order to enhance the atmosphere. The broken Artifactor statue whispered to you a story about this place that you were exploring, foretold of the threat that you were about to face. But the Chozo memories just explain everything to you, after the game's done, apropos of nothing. That's convenient for the folk updating the wiki, I suppose, but that's not good storytelling. You might think from all of this that I dislike Samus Returns, and not at all actually. I'm not even remotely disappointed with it. I played through it, I went back to play Metroid 2, I played AM2R, I played Samus Returns again, and all I can think about is how much I want to play more Metroid. But this is me we're talking about. You could key my car in the shape of a Metroid and I'd be delighted. So, you know, you're not going to get objectivity out of me. I'm telling myself that it has faults, but I'm still really stoked about it. But I think that says something as well. I haven't been this excited by a Metroid game in years. I don't ever need Metroid to be perfect, I just need it to be Metroid. And this is recognisably the series that I love. These guys clearly gave a damn. It's just that while Samus Returns has the passion for Metroid, while it's got the heart, it doesn't have the brains of a Metroid game. You can see it trying to do some interesting stuff, like remix the old escape sequences with the Diggernaut, but the execution is just off. It is reaching for those top shelf ideas, but it's never quite getting them. And man, that is a great problem to have. That is so refreshing after a decade of Nintendo exhibiting nothing but disdain for the series' legacy. I'm very happy with Samus Returns as a statement of intent, but that doesn't mean that it's a return to form. But then remaking Metroid 2 in a post-Super Metroid world was always going to be a fruitless effort. It is simply not designed like a traditional Metroid. I love Metroid 2, but I'm glad we've got that inevitable remake out the way so that the series can move onwards and hopefully upwards. As for me, well, I knew even before I started that there was only ever going to be 2 Metroid ones in my eye. Yeah, we're going to flub that last line, okay, good. No, that's how I'm ending it. That's it, end of the video. Bye.